Hello and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG Podcast. I am Clayton.
And I'm Elliot.
Before we get started, I would like to remind our listeners that you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. Episodes are available on most podcatchers, and episodes are also available on YouTube at the channel Alien Familiar Media. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com, and we are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. Thank you for joining us today. Today we are going to be talking about world building. We're going to be talking about some of the very high level aspects of creating worlds, and we're also going to be talking about some of the more nitty gritty, getting things ready for actually setting up the world itself and like interacting with the world. But Elliot, this was your topic for discussion today, so why don't you go ahead and give a little bit more of an idea of how you want this conversation to progress today.
Well, yeah. So I suggested that we do a topic on world building in general, and then the more I thought about it, as long-winded as I am, I suggested we narrow it down just to map making, because when I think of world building, there's a lot of different aspects, but really for me, it all kind of started with just making a map and figuring out what's in it. So yeah, I think map making is a great, it's a great topic within world building if that's where we want to stop it, or a launching pad if we want to make it a series. We'll see how it goes. All
right. So what about making maps is making you want to talk about this? Because me personally, I hate making maps. It's the least fun aspect of role-playing games after creating puzzles for me.
Go a little deeper, if you would, about your experience in map making, because I've kind of always kept it to myself a little bit, because I just assumed everybody shared my love of it. It's been weird finding out that a lot of people really hate making maps.
Well, I hate making all sorts of maps. I hate making continent-sized maps, world maps. I hate making region-sized maps. I hate making maps for the layouts of dungeons. I hate making the battle maps that you're going to be using in each combat. So I can talk about each one of my hates in depth if you want me to.
Oh, yes, I do, actually. Why don't you start with the world map?
Okay. Why I hate the world map. 1, I don't care. 2, the players don't care. Nobody cares about the layout of the geography of the region in which the game takes place. It's nice to have a visual representation so that whenever the players ask how long will it take to get from point A to point B, there is something that can be visually referenced. But it's entirely unneeded. The DM just says this location is so and so distance away. And the way I have personally played it, and the way I have seen and experienced so many DMs handle it, is if there is not a digital calculator for determining how far one thing is from another thing in a role-playing game, it is entirely up to DM fiat how long it takes for player characters to get from one point to another. I think it's something that almost never comes up as a plot relevant issue. And even when it does become a plot relevant issue, J. Michael Straczynski, the creator of Babylon 5, the TV series, said it best when a fan asked him how fast a particular fighter in the series traveled. He explained that it travels at the speed of plot. That means that things go and things happen as quickly or as slowly as they need to. I don't think that there is a crucial need to know that the city of Waterdeep is so many days of land travel or so many days of water travel from the city of water, or from of Neverwinter. I don't see where that is a crucial piece of information that players need to know and needs to be consistent from game to game.
Yeah, I think that, okay. So I guess I'll just start with, my own personal experience with it. I think that you're 100% correct. I think that the first thing that most homebrew world builders kind of aiming at, say, like D&D, but I think it can also be true of fantasy authors, perhaps. I know a lot of the books in the fantasy genre start with that map on the inside, and I guess that's where it started with me. Any book over the years that you just pick up that draws you in, like Lord of the Rings or The Wheel of Time. What else would be another good one? Any of them, they all have a fantasy map for their world. It's kind of like a staple. But for me, that was inspiring. But in the D&D hobby too, I've been frantically trying to find the author, the illustrator's name, and I'll find it because he's rather famous in the hobby for innovating very 3D, beautiful, engaging maps for Forgotten Realms. So I purchased the Forgotten Realms 3rd edition campaign setting, and just the maps in that particular book blew me away. There's nothing really super fancy about them. I've been going back through them recently, just for funsies, and they're for these days are just kind of like your standard map. But it was that book in particular that really drove into like the type of maps that you'd find created by more advanced software like Photoshop, but back before then it was all usually more the classic D&D map looks of grids and hand drawn and illustrate. I'm sure I don't know a whole lot of them. I'm sure there are plenty of great maps in the 2nd edition stuff, but that was literally a pivot moment, I guess, in the hobby when maps started looking more like they do now. And it just blew me away. You could see the forests, you could see everything. And for me, that inspired me to start making my own campaign in my own world. And so I sat down and drew my very first map, which I still have, surprisingly enough. And why maps, I guess. Clayton, have you ever, let's forget the world map, we'll talk about that in a second. Have you ever created a map yourself that really helped you in your world, in building the story forward, or just helped you, that you found to be a good experience, or have they all been negative?
I would not say they've all been negative. I would say at best they have been neutral. As far as the maps I have created, I have had one singular example of a map that was made for me with a DM who put a lot of very, very obvious care in creating a world map, or not a world map, it was a region map of the area in which the game was taking place. And the only reason that sticks out for me is because literally months ahead of, like, we were given this map, and literally months later in the campaign, there were things that were hidden in the map, like in the shapes of certain things that became clues that drove the plot forward later on in the campaign. A big shout out to Paul, PJ, if you're listening to our podcast. I'm talking about you and our Greyhawk campaign, where I was playing the spoiled rich noble. That map is the example that I come to whenever I want to think about a map that is done right and a map that actually matters to the players.
Right. So, me today, when I sit down to make a map, I do it simply for its own sake and the hobby. It's been a long time since I've ran a game. I think any reforming DM is always kind of plotting a game, I guess you could say, in the back of their head, but nothing really. Most of the time, I just want to draw a map for a particular reason. I want to, I've seen a map that I want to emulate, or there's a type of map that's common I haven't tried, or a format. But the reason for me is, I think there's pros and cons to starting with a world map. Most people just want to start there because they want to emulate the books they've seen, and they emulate the media that they've seen. But I agree with you. I think that, especially for a young GM, and this was the case for me, can still kind of be, is that when you start with a world map, you are overwhelming yourself immediately. You run the risk of, you've created a huge blank canvas the size of continents and, vast beyond kingdoms even. And, so Clayton, let me ask see if it's an obvious, problem. What's the problem with that?
Well, it becomes an issue of like you just said, you're creating this big, huge map, and maps that big have to have things in them. It's showing all of the areas where you have to put in work.
Exactly.
I like to start off very small whenever I'm creating my campaigns. Like unless I'm playing in a campaign that is already established, either because I am recycling material that I created years ago from a previous campaign, or I'm playing in an established setting, I never start with a huge empty or a huge map that has to be filled in. The map is something that becomes filled in as the players' characters go out into the world and can reach further and further.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think what you're running the risk of is a lot of people get discouraged because they end up they see all the empty space, they start to fill it, and then they realize they've bit off more than they can chew, and a lot of people end up getting discouraged. And, but anywho, for me, I think maps mainly for me, they're just a fun hobby, but putting them in game terms, there's a lot of advantages, I think, to world building if that's your style of play. And first of all, not to discourage from building a world map. I think that's a perfectly fine way to start, and I'd like to talk a little bit about how to make those, in my opinion. But I think the first thing that a DM needs to do is make a pact to themselves is that they're drawing a map that they're never going to show their players. I think that's the key. Make your world map if you want, but you don't ever show it to your players. Depending on your world, if you're in a low fantasy game, there's no way they'd know it anyway. So a player shouldn't even have that. But two, it's kind of anticipating a lot of your problems with it, Clayton, is like once you show a world map to a group of players, they're going to inevitably find a place they want to go that's different than where they are because they get interested in it. And the next thing you know, they're going off the grid and beyond your ability to create content, or they're making your life more difficult because they're going all over the world. So, a lot of people, they create something, they want to show it off, right? So the world map is only a good place to start if you're willing to understand that most of it's going to stay blank probably forever, but also you should never show it to your players. But for me personally, I think that visuals at the table are extremely important, especially in a digital environment where you're competing with, a bunch of unseen stimulus, like people are in their homes or distracted by their families and things. Being able to throw a visual either online to your players is very engaging and keeps people playing. It also keeps people interested in your world. And also, in a real setting, if you have access to the printing of it, or if you, take advantage, my wife a few years ago bought me for Christmas a map that I had of a world that I've spent a lot of time building. And she screen printed it for me for like very cheap, like less than $50. I got a screen print of it, and it hangs on my wall, and it's cool. And that would be cool to use in game. But, examples for me of where a visual can draw in, most players can relate to and who've played 5th edition D&D. I think the Phandelver, the Phandelver, module is a great example because it has a really cool dungeon and it's a good dungeon map. But to me, the region map is where every DM, at least that to me is where if you take the time to make your own map, I think it can lead to creation. See, to me, that's the main thing about building the map, isn't so much as having a visual guide, a way to relay to your players point A's to point B's. To me, it is creating that, giving yourself a blank canvas. It's, going as far as to create a visual representation of a given geography with, obstacles like forests, swamps, trees, maybe some cities, and then roads, and then you can go holy sites. I mean, it's on and on, ruins, And to me, a good region map, like they have the one in that particular module, I just remember getting that map and feeling free as a player. You know what I mean? I think if you can give a good region map to a group, it gives them this false sense of freedom and liberation. And if you can, I think any DM worth their salt who wants to homebrew a setting, I mean, if you're really wanting to take that on, having a rough sketch of a couple of small towns, maybe one like larger or main town, and knowing the people who live with that, creating the people who live with that, and then the threats that live in that region. I think that what that does, it leads your creativity. You know what I mean? It can inspire you to put something there and make an NPC or create a subplot that you would not have otherwise. You know what I mean? So for me, the use of maps for the players, a GM, I think, owes the players a good visual from time to time. And having a good, at least region or town map is really useful to players to visualize where they are and motivates them to go into different directions rather than being held by the hand and pulled along. And it also, as the world builder, it can still be contained. A good region map can still be contained within a small enough space that you can fill it with a lot of content, and it inspires you to do so. You know what I mean? Your creativity might draw a swamp just for giggles, but then after you've done it, you're like, that can, for me at least, that drives me into, doing the stuff that I don't like. Personally, I'm not a systems guy. I think that's my particular thing. I don't really care much about the system that I'm playing in as much as like NPCs and stuff. So like actually getting into the meat of like, getting the stats ready and getting all the roles ready and getting in there and making sure you learn the rules. A lot of that can be pushed by my greater need in my mind to put something there. It'll force me into the book to go make an NPC, I guess you could say, or a magic item or something like that. Because just in me, it's like, I've got to put something in that empty space. That looked too cool. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So whenever you are making one of these region level maps, how do you decide what goes a particular place? Is it entirely up to your whims at the moment, or do you use some sort of systematic approach for it?
No, I mean, it's for me, and again, like I will say, the map making side is more of a hobby than the DM itself, and than the game itself. So I've made so many different maps, and usually when I make a map, more often than not, I've seen something that inspires me, and it's usually like a design element from someone else's map. So here's a good example to kind of get a little bit more dialed in on the topic. I've prepared a list of talking points, and one of the things I wanted to do was go into the different types of maps and the way I see them as being useful for a hobbyist. And, we've talked about region a little bit. So for me, a region map, I think there's two schools of thought out there, and you have kind of the old school, new school, and he's not here, but I would guarantee you that Jordan would all be hard for the old school style. But for me, a region map personally would be best. It works best for my imagination if it's not hyper realistic. A lot of maps these days and in modern media, they typically try to emulate like a Google map or a more stylized style of Google map, a type of map that, unless you had that bird's eye view, would be really difficult to actually make in most worlds, in most times. I've recently been trying to move to a hex-based grid and really think in terms of like, if I say I make a group of hexes, I just take a blank sheet of hex paper or a hex template, and I say, okay, each one is a day or a quarter day by travel distance or whatever. I think in terms of each individual hex. And I think, what am I going to put here? Is it going to be a part of a forest? If the players are going to have to travel through it, what are the threats in that forest? And that'll or what's something neat to put in this hex? I mean, you can't do that for every single hex, depending on how many you do. But like, I've found that a lot of maps I really like these days, they'll dedicate, say, a whole hex to a really exaggerated castle, say, or a very like ominous looking volcano, or a couple of hexes might be this really murky, boggy swamp that has like bone hands sticking out of it, or a skull or something of that nature. For me, when I'm making a region map specifically, I'm trying to entice the players into each hex. And by doing so, I'm also committing to, I know what's in each hex. Does that make sense? I want a region map to call to the players and kind of have them visually latch onto an element that I've put there that kind of puts a pin in that player's mind. Like, if I get the chance, I want to go there, and then allow the plot that you've created, which is going to be fairly railroady and narrow most of the time. But then it also allows you to kind of rely on this visual element to pull people into other directions that makes it feel like they have control. In reality, you've already put something there. You're just waiting on them to come. Does that make sense?
So, just so that I'm understanding you correctly, you're advocating for the creation of like a region map where in one particular hex or something like that will be like a base of operations, like at the start of the campaign, for instance. And then each hex radiating out from that is going to have one important thing somewhere in it that you, the DM, know, but maybe not the players know?
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. And it could be as simple as the Phandelver map. I mean, the Phandelver map, if you look at that region map, it's a fairly standard map of our time, of this kind of era. But, I think what it does have is, it has multiple cities. This Thunder Tree, I believe, was one of the towns you could go to, but it has obviously Phandalin, which will act as your home base. And it positions Phandalin on the map and then has other locations marked or unmarked. I mean, it depends on, I can't remember if it has the unmarked map with the PDFs or not. But I know that in Strahd, for instance, is probably the best example of a region map driving story. That map is so cool and so good, that it pulls people all over the map. But it allows, the players to, it encourages creativity, and not creativity, but curiosity. But it also grounds it into a visual medium that you as a DM, for me anyway, I look at my map and I see it as a commitment. It's like, if I'm making a region map, that's not so overwhelming given the lead time that you start working on your world. That, I mean, say it's, I don't know, let's throw a random thing out, like a hex grid that's 12 by 12, big hexes, right? That you can really draw some decent images in each hex, or decent, plot hooks, I guess you could say, locations. Still the majority of it's going to be empty, or, it's going to be a lot of just bland, this is a forest hex or whatever. But, it allows you to say, I'm going to nest 7 interesting icons on this map. I'm going to make a city, I'm going to make this, and I'm going to make that, or whatever. And then you have to go at least put something there in your mind. Put a little bit on paper about who's there, what it is, what they're going to find there. And by the end of it, you'll almost be waiting for the players to go there. You know what I mean? Even if you don't put it on the main quest, Yeah,
I think I see what you're saying. So it sounds like you're very much in support of, basically front loading a lot of the creation of the world in the map at the very beginning of the campaign. Would you say that's accurate?
Oh, definitely. I mean, and that's obviously not an ideal way to game build. Like, say you just have to scratch an itch and you want a game and you got a kernel of an idea. That's not going to be for this. This is for more of a long-term hobby. If you enjoy the world building itself, I feel like that lead time is probably something you're already doing. If it's not something that you're doing as a hobby already, give it a try. You might like it. But it's definitely not the easiest way to world build. Can we talk about dungeon maps?
Well, before we do that, I have a question for you. When you were a kid, or now, did you just like having maps? Like, did you have like a real world atlas or something that had a bunch of maps in it? Or did you, as a as a kid, did you just like having maps?
Yeah, for sure. My dad's a geography teacher, so I have to think that some of that was just baked into just conversations maybe I had, but of course I was so young. I don't really remember my dad. He wasn't the most passionate teacher in the world, but watching him help raise my son, that was one of their favorite things to do, is go around and, Dad would point out all the geography and tell the history of it if he knew. And yeah, I definitely always had maps when I was a kid. Maps of visual, just I've always been a visual person. So being able to put something into a visual context has always helped me and drawn my attention. So yeah, I've always been that person that opens up a magazine and stares. If there's like a weird map in it, I'll stare at that more than anything. It's funny. When I was a kid, I was raised in a church, and they recently gave away a bunch of stuff, old stuff, and I went over with my mom and we looked around. The only thing I carted out of it was this huge, imagine your school, most of us who are older remembers the drawdown maps from history class. They had one of those of Israel, and there's like 7 different maps of the biblical, Palestine, and it was so cool. So yes.
I think I know exactly what maps you're talking about, because I went to a church when I was a kid who had exactly what you're describing.
Yeah, I could just wax on. That's why I made this little checklist for myself. I want to stay focused because I do have a lot to say on these different topics.
Before we shift down into a smaller scale, do you have any advice for not creating everything up front, but just kind of having it evolve as the game progresses?
Oh yeah, 100%. First of all, giving a map to your party, again, is totally optional. And me personally, I would say my map making hobby as its own thing has really ramped up in the last couple of years. Just because of technology. To talk a little bit before we do move on. I guess I've got it in the back part of my notes, so I'll save it for like the medium on which you draw, but, it doesn't have to be anything more complicated than an extremely ugly, crude map with 2 or 3 dots on it with named towns and a couple of other little features you want to build into your game, and just you can leave the rest blank. I mean, pull out your grid paper, sketch out your town with some rectangles and a couple lines for walls, and then maybe go on to the next page, put that on a little region map, give it 2 or 3 other little friends, I guess you could say. I mean, and personally, I will point people back to the Forgotten Realms campaign guide, because I think that's a really great example of how you can be concise in your world building. Because when you look at that, it's full of maps. And so you can tell that the creators were overwhelmed by stuff that they could say. So that each region that they go into and describe has a really great formula that they wrote with population and like religion, culture, classes, government, that kind of thing. And just most of the areas that would fit in a region map for your little campaign the description for that area occupies less than a page, so, it can, as long as you have a general 1 sentence, 2 sentence idea of what the idea behind each location is, and a couple of names that you can throw in as random NPCs, then it's just up to your ability to ad lib, which as a DM, I think is something I do okay. So I'm never really too afraid to put something on there and not really flesh it out too much.
So, one of the ways that I've developed for making region maps, and a way in which I create the region map as the players explore, is I've used this twice, one of which was a game you were in, Elliot, our New World game that I was using the Savage Worlds system for. And also I played a D&D game, a West March style game, using this method, where you start off in whatever the base is, and I created a formula for whenever the players moved into a new hex, I would make a roll to see what the terrain was, and I would also make a roll to see if they discovered anything interesting in that particular hex. And that's how I built out a significant portion of the regions for those games. Was as the characters explored, more of the world was discovered, and as more of the world was discovered, I would see themes, or I would see reoccurring things come up in the map, and I would slowly start to realize, okay, this region right here, it must be a plains region, because we've had several grasslands rolled for this particular hex cluster, or this particular hex cluster is a forest, or there must be a river going through here. Using that to kind of flesh out the map as the players explore it. I don't remember the exact scale I was using in both those games, but it was something like either a half day or a 4 or 5 hour journey would move you from one hex into another. So every 4 or 5 or 6 hours of in-game travel, I was rolling to see what the next terrain would be, and rolling to see whether or not the player characters encountered anything interesting in that particular hex. And I was using a program to keep track of all of this, which I'll talk more about in depth later. I was using Worldographer for it, but for a region that they moved into, a hex that they moved into that didn't already have, or that I didn't roll that there was an interesting thing in, that just meant that the player characters didn't encounter the interesting thing in that hex during that pass through. So if the player characters were going to go out and more thoroughly explore each hex, then they would inevitably find the interesting thing that was in that hex, and I would make a roll. And I had tables for determining, like, depending on the terrain type, what type of interesting locale or interesting feature of the terrain was in that particular hex. So everything was procedurally generated as we went through the campaign, and I think that in play that worked out pretty well. But both of those were online games. Both of those were games where I had an automated way of rolling several dice at once in order to generate all of those statistics at once.
You know, I'm conflicted on this particular, how to reply to this, because you're using an example from your own game, and having played in that game, the game was turning out fine, and I was having a lot of fun with it. On the but just to kind of play devil's advocate a little bit, but also I do kind of feel this way. Part of me just really hates that idea. And it's weird because for a long time, when I would just think about the hobby, my biggest complaint about games I've played in, being railroaded and pushed into somebody's, somebody's darling idea, they just have to show to their players this really nasty keep and this really evil dungeon they made. So the procedural idea sounds great on that. I will say, though, to advocate for the preloading, the front-loading hobby, again, if you enjoy it, obviously, if making maps just is something you find tedious and hateful, there's a billion of them out there. Just go steal one. Go buy one. You can get so much great content in the Roll20 store and elsewhere that can be, generic maps that are great quality, that even have like all the features, dynamic lighting, all that stuff. But for the front loading thing against procedural style is, a friend of mine who's a great artist, and he was trying to teach me how to improve my game and just drawing in general. He said something to me I think that applies great to this in gaming in general, is he said, when you're starting to come up with an idea, or you have a character, or you have a scene in your mind, when you're actually drawing it, make sure to make that scene the most exciting scene, the most exciting moment of that person's life. Does that make sense? That if you're going to bother to draw something and turn it into art, it's not really always the most fun or enjoyable to just draw a normal picture. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who disagree, but to me, I think it's the same way with your D&D games, is that, when you do procedural anything, and that's just random encounters, that's this idea of random build in maps, I guess, and any other procedural ways to play the games, they have their place. But if it's too much of a feature in the game, me personally, it's like, as a DM, you can't do it. It's hard to do foreshadowing. It's hard to build up the build up the drama if you yourself don't know where they're going. It's hard to, because a lot of times they're going to we found a couple of really cool things. We also would spend many, many, many rolls and much in-game time, just going through empty hexes that had clues towards things that would distract us or give us the wrong impression. We'd go in a different direction away from interesting content. And I could see, and as a player in that game, like, I will say that there were times where that was whenever I was like feeling the most like disconnected, I guess, from the immersion, I guess you could say, is when it was just, all right, we're slogging through some hexes, y'all. Just let's roll. And on the DM side, I'm sure, I can't remember, but I'm sure it would take a little time. It'd be like, what's in this hex? I don't know. Let's roll. Okay. And then there'd be like downtime. Me personally, I feel like, I don't think that the players are owed that much freedom. Does that make sense?
From a certain point of view, it makes sense. I completely disagree. But I think that the players the players want all of the freedom you're going to give them. And I run a lot of my games on the fly. I do a lot of pre-prep. Don't get me wrong. I create adventures. In my description of the hexes, like, if something interesting were going on in that hex that I rolled for, I had a table that was basically of the plot hooks that I wanted in the game, and it was randomly determined which plot hook might be in that particular hex. Like in the game where you guys were in the New World, like, when you guys actually encountered natives was going to be entirely up to the dice rolls. I didn't have a set location for where you would encounter the natives. They were somewhere in the world, and they were Schrodinger's natives. They were going to be there, and at some point, I didn't know when they were going to show up, and the hex that they were going to be in was going to influence how far away their main settlement was. But I was ready to create I had several different native tribes that were going to be in the region, depending on what type of terrain that they were in whenever you guys discovered them. I had some basically plains style natives. I had some that were dense forest dwellers. I had some that dwelled in the mountains. I had a couple of each, some good, some potentially enemies. So just because I was procedurally creating everything, procedurally creating the hexes and what was in the hexes, doesn't mean that I didn't create ahead of time the encounters of the world.
Yeah, and I know that that's true from playing in your games. You're always the most prepared DM I've ever met, and then that I was bummed whenever that game could not continue, because the exploration of it was fascinating to me, and especially if you hate the world building part, or if you find it tedious, or the map making in particular. I think that's a great solution for anyone. You can procedurally create your map, and it doesn't have to be anything more fancy than, a free hex grid maker that you can put colors in and take some notes. I think you can run a perfectly fun and successful game. But really what inspired me, even in the topic in general, isn't so much like world building and drawing maps. They're not particularly a good way to optimize your gaming as a DM. Like, it's not going to be an efficient way to run your games. It's definitely not what I'm advocating for sure. Because besides one, it says a lot that the only game I've ever ran long term in the last 20 years was a Strahd pre-gen game, because it's hard. It's hard to make a game, and it's hard to keep it going on completely your own creativity. But I'm also gathering, which is why I suggested this topic, that there's a lot of people like me who either don't get the chance to play, or don't take the time to build the community, or don't want to take the time, who've always fell in love with that world building part. And I would encourage, that's what this really is all about, is encouraging people to enjoy the map making for the map making's sake, and you might be surprised that it ends up filling out the world. Can I say one thing about that? Another reason why I think that's good?
Go for it.
The homebrewing, I guess, versus pre-genning or whatever is, going back to the world map versus the region map. Even if you make a region map, players are still going to ask questions about off-map issues and cultures and things of that nature. People are still going to wonder what's off the map.
And I want to interject, there will also be that one player or players at the table who are like, I want to go over here and point 3 inches off of the map.
Why is it wrong to tell them no?
Depends on who you ask. I don't think it's wrong to tell them no.
I mean, and I guess what you're really, who and why I mean by that is you said that player. Fuck that player. I mean, in every time we say it in every context, there's always going to be that player. There's always going to be that player who has no interest or care or respect for the fact that GM is doing 99% of the effort. There's going to be always going to be that player who just for whatever reason enjoys pointing to that place they don't think you're ready for and going there. But, to me, if you're not ready or you didn't put anything there, and the players, you just got that guy who's just insistent, just don't put anything there. Make them slog there for 10 days or whatever, and they find a ruin that you drew that was interesting or not, or they just go off the map just to get their jollies. And you reward them with a really difficult journey that gets them nothing. I don't see anything wrong with that. Side
tangent, my favorite published setting for handling situations like that is the Dark Sun setting, where literally in the world the known world is approximately the size of the U.S. state of Colorado, and the entire rest of the world is as an obsidian glass covered desert.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think sometimes DMs put too much pressure on themselves because they are performative. They are putting themselves out there and saying, I can present to you this wonderful experience. But I think GMs take it in the chest, I guess, a little bit whenever players do run off their creativity. I know it happened in Strahd a bunch of times for me. But, at a certain, it's just like, I take the same approach to that person who asks specific questions about stuff like that. There's nothing wrong with them asking it, especially if they're just showing curiosity and interest. But there's also nothing wrong with saying, I just haven't gotten there yet. I mean, you guys can go there and I'll put things there and I promise it'll be fun. But, I don't really have anything there. I work full time, I have a family. I've generated what I've generated, but I haven't gotten there yet. Nothing wrong with that.
Another valid answer is you haven't been there. You don't know.
Yeah. And again, this goes back to some of my best advice, and it's kind of counterintuitive because most GMs who really love to world build, I've noticed they love to show off their shiny trinkets, but you should only give players maps even if you've made it or not, you should only give players maps when they need it. And only as much of the world as you want or need them to know. Spending days or hours making a beautiful map doesn't mean you have to show it to them, I'd wanted to do a side tangent before I forgot, and I forgot, so it must have not been very important.
So, is there anything else you want to say before we drill down a little bit smaller than the region map?
No, there's a couple things I want to say to people who, are interested in the map making for its own sake. As far as how it complements the world and stuff, I invite those questions too, because it's possible I haven't thought about them. But in my personal journey of map making, I've really developed, I think, I've developed a lot more than I kind of give myself credit for. And I really want to give people who are interested in the topic some shortcuts.
Okay.
I guess we've already talked a lot about maps in general and region maps, and world maps. But, the most common one I think is the dungeon map. It's definitely the oldest. And, I don't really have a lot to say about dungeon maps. I think once you've gotten to your dungeon maps, I don't know, Clayton, would you agree that regardless of how big the world is, once the players go into a depth, they expect and you need a completely finished product that is that dungeon?
Yeah, I have never experienced or been able to develop a procedural way of creating a dungeon. I don't think there is one that works well.
Yeah, I agree. So As far as making your own dungeons, really the only interesting thought that I've had on them is if you're like me and you're an old head and you've just seen the top-down map and Jordan's even, I wish I could remember, I'll ask him and maybe throw it in the next pod, but there's a design elements and Jaquazian? Yeah, Jaquazian map design. I would, if you're going to make the leap to do it yourself, I would read up on those, that specific style, because it's a good way to kind of make fun maps to play in. I would encourage players or DMs who want to apply the same kind of inspiration. Cause for me, that's why I draw my maps, is that I have a hard time just creating ideas off the top of my head. But if I can make it visual, they just start popping off. So like, if you've made those top-down maps till you're dead of doing it or sick of doing it, I like isometric maps, and maybe they're pretty common, so most people probably seen them or even made them already. But if you haven't, or even haven't tackled making one, when it comes to dungeon making, I find it very fun because it creates a 3D element, again, for your use, not necessarily for the players. And you can it makes, when you start to sprinkle in like, corpses or idols or statues or columns or whatever, it gives you the opportunity to be creative and draw it in there. And it kind of grabs you a little bit and pulls you deeper in the dungeon and kind of encourages you to finish it. You know what I mean?
So if you're not an artist, how do you make a isometric or map?
Oh, well, have you seen one? Right? I mean, are you familiar with what one looks like when I say it?
Describe it to me as if I didn't.
Okay. Well, an isometric map is a 3D rendering, rather. So whenever you can get two types of sketch paper. You can get isometric paper, which is like a series of triangles that really just are cubes. They have the same kind of grid lines that you would on a regular square grids, except it creates cubes. And so what it allows you to do is just, whenever you start your line and you run it across, and if you follow the cubes that you can see on this page rather than the squares, what it does, it creates depth, the illusion of depth. And it lends itself really well to D&D dungeon map making. So like, I would point you to the Strahd, box set, because they provide with the Strahd materials an isometric rendering of the Castle Strahd. And every area of the map has a top-down version and an isometric version. And functionally, the top-down is, going to be the most useful to put on the grid and for the players. But just if you show it to the players, or a part of it to the players, it makes you want to go into it. I don't know what it is about the 3D rendering. It just makes you want to. As far as the details of how to literally draw it in there, there's a million YouTube videos how to draw in isometrics. But once you start to play around with the paper, it becomes pretty obvious how to do it. And because all you really have to do is make two lines, and you see the depth, and it just kind of makes you want to draw more, And when we get to the digital medium, there's a lot of great programs that build in isometric guides for you, specifically Procreate.
So you mentioned a little bit ago Jaquazian maps. What exactly is that?
Again, I'm going to point people to the internet because it's definitely not something I've mastered. But the kernel that I kept from it when I read about it was making sure that all your maps lead somewhere unless they don't for a reason. Making sure that there's a flow to the design of the dungeon, that everywhere leads to a place that engages the player in something they're going to find interesting, like either a treasure room or the next level of the dungeon, or something worth exploring like a library or something like that. But making sure that when you are designing your maps, that the map itself of the dungeon's designed to push the players through it in an interesting way, so that everywhere they go, there's somewhere to go. Does that make sense?
Yeah, give me just 1 second. I'm actually looking up the definition of Jaquazian because I had a different idea in my mind.
I mean, that might be the case. It's just the reason why I mentioned it was I was making an isometric map of a dungeon once, and I read an article about Jaquazian design, and once I read it, I immediately started to erase and make sure that, like for instance, like if there's a final boss room, and you put a lock, say like a gate or a door that has a lock in it, anticipate that they might not get it open. You might want to put a secret door in there or a back entrance or some other way to get there. That way the players don't get stopped by one skill check they didn't make, that kind of a consideration. So I was able to add a couple extra details to my map because I just hadn't thought about that. But I would really recommend anybody who's wanting to make their own dungeons, be familiar with the Jaquezian method at the very least as a starting point. Not that I am.
So because I'm a terrible speller, I can't find a definition of Jaquezian mapping very easily. So my understanding of what Jaquezian mapping involves is that there's not just one way to get from point A to point B. There might be multiple routes that are available. There might even be looping routes that come back to an original place. This was very important in very early multiplayer mapping in like Doom and Quake, for designing maps in those, that there was a structure on the dungeons where you could get to several different places on the map different ways, and the ways came back to each other so that you could eventually find your way back to the start without having to take the same route. And that was a key point of the Jaquezian style of doing it, to actually present more options to the players as they are exploring the dungeon, where the decisions that they made were meaningful decisions because they would allow the players to potentially bypass threats that they weren't able to handle, or handle things in different ways.
Yeah, that rings true. But, as far as, I don't have a lot to say about dungeon design. It's just not my favorite part. But plus there's just so much free out there. There's so many good dungeons out there. It would be just as advantageous to go nest. I mean, in my mind, the perfect idea is to take, your region map and fill it with kind of your own ideas, but then run out and get some canned dungeons and either reskin them for your own world or just keep them in there and just build them in.
I am a big fan of the finding a map that is existent on the internet and just repurposing it. I have gigs of maps saved on my computer for dungeons and cities and all the different types of terrain that I might want to have a map in, for either for digital games to just drag and drop the map onto a virtual tabletop, or to use as my basis whenever I'm making a map or adapting a map for play at the table. So I can just print it out. And all of these digital maps can be shrunk down so that they fit on a single page. I can print it out on a single piece of paper and then take it to my game and have as reference, and whenever it comes to time to have a combat, I can draw a version of it on the map that the players are using there at the table.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that at all. Though, I mean, I guess the point of the pod, and I guess the next bullet point I have is maybe to kind of challenge you to up your game, because I wrote down the next section I wanted to hit was called Make Your Own, which we probably won't get through because we're getting long in the tooth. But I really do think that it's, especially with all the tools available out there, that it's never been easier. I'm not particularly a good artist, I don't think. I think anything's a craft is just practice. And the thing that always keeps me from doing exactly what you're doing is I feel caged as a DM the way that a player might feel caged in a game that I run, because when I make a culture, I make a world, I'm intentionally trying to make it feel weird or feel alien in some way. And there's no better way to make a place just feel different than reality than just mess with the geography. One of the considerations you'll see on a lot of videos out there is how to make them realistic, making sure your rivers don't run the wrong way, make sure you're minding elevations and, not doing things that are not realistic, I guess you could say, that would slap someone who knows, who looks at your map would just slap them in the face immediately. But I kind of push back against even that logic, because the whole point of fantasy is for it to be different. And, when you make your own, you can really, you can make mountains that don't exist. You can make rivers that don't exist. You can make geography that's really stark, maybe like a sheer cliff for no reason. To me, all those things are interesting, and things that, if you've got an idea like that calls for a particular kind of geography, it's going to take so long to find it. Like, you might even never. Yeah, and, if you can't find a visual representation, then you're just going to lose the idea. Whereas I guess I've just taken to, I think, just the tools are so available. It would be just as easy, just whip out take a little time to learn how to do it and just make one yourself,
Make one yourself with what?
Well, I guess it depends. Like, say you really want to feature a volcano, but that volcano is an idea I had recently, a map I'm playing with now. It's a long lost civilization, obviously, but it had something to do with harnessing the power of lava and the heat. So, like, it was built into the base of a volcano. And of course, the volcano eventually just consumed them. And so the ruins of it is very has a lot of, it's like, buildings that have been completely covered by magma or barely sticking out. And you've got the wreckage of the blast or whatever, this very hostile environment. And then, obviously then you just make it look very Mordor-y and like lots of jagged lines in your mountains, make it look real scary. And then once you've got that, then you can just, you can either drop that into a pre-existing mountain or a pre-existing map. Or, you just build a region map around it. That might be the beginning of your next map and next campaign, I mean, even as far as like the type of architectural styles, it's like I want a Romanesque city nestled in this mountain, and then over here I want an Egyptian city or whatever. I mean, you can do that conceptually in your mind, but I don't know. I just find it more fun to draw it.
I've never been that great of an artist, and actually physically drawing stuff is a mountain too tall for me. I depend a lot on digital tools for creating all the maps that I use. If I'm going to create a map, most of the time I just borrow something that's already been made. But what types of digital tools do you use? Because I mentioned earlier that I use Worldographer. I've owned a copy of that for many years at this point, and I love it because it is perfectly designed for people like me who don't want to have to draw all of this stuff, because the way it works is you can have it auto-generate a continent, and then you can click a few buttons and it'll automatically drill down to a smaller region, and then you can push a few more buttons and it'll automatically drill down to a smaller region, and each time it's creating more intricate detail in the map, so that each time you drill down there is more of the map made, so you don't have to go back and try to tie the different parts of your original map together. And you can do that in reverse. You can be very narrow. You could have a very small region map, and you can just go in reverse and create bigger and bigger regions in much the same way.
Yeah, I've played around with a few of those. I don't really know why I've never really explored those programs too deeply. I think Incarnate. I definitely played around with that. I've compiled a list of I think, what was it? Is it Hero Forge? Let me look at my list. There's a really great blog out there that I was going to point players to. I'll pull it up now. It has a list of the 12 best, a list of like recommended, and there's a bunch out there, and most of them I recognized from, like I said, there's a good world map, Azagar's fantasy map generator out there. It'll just make a fully formed world map for you, which is really cool. one click. Same thing for City Maker. There's a free generator called Whataboos. And it'll make you a city that looks really cool, and with names and compass rose and everything. And you can manipulate them as you go. I mean, World Anvil, there's the one that's been around forever. I'm trying to find. Campaign Cartographer is probably the gold standard, if you want to pay some money. But I've never really played around with them too extensively. And I don't know why. I personally prefer, maybe it's just that was my daydream hobby. I mean, I started on pencil paper, regular ruled pencil paper, and then, you go to Walmart, you buy some hex paper or some square paper, drafting paper, grid paper, notebooks of that you can fill with straight lines. I mean, those are perfectly fine. But I've found that with digital tools, anything with layering gives you the power that you need to make your own map with very little, need for creative talent. So to get into the weeds, I guess, for people who think, oh man, I've just made maps forever. I'm just terrible at it. I don't like them. They don't enjoy it or whatever. Or they don't enjoy it because they don't have the skill to make it on paper. I would definitely use one of those pre-gens. I mean, you can whip out a map with very little time investment. You can make a really great map on your first day, and it'll probably suit your preferences. That's just not the type of hobby I'm interested in, for some reason. And you didn't enjoy doing that, though? I've always enjoyed playing with them, though, like a video game almost. Like, I find that in its own right, like a very fun thing to do. Just make a map in one of those you didn't even find that fun?
No, I didn't. I don't.
Hmm.
It's always just a chore for me. I don't care about, I just don't care about that. I care about creating the characters and the stories and the physical aspects of the world. I don't care.
I wonder if a couple years ago I got way into Tolkien. It was always like one of my hidden shames is that I'd never read those books, and I still haven't. But I did read the Silmarillion cover to cover a couple times, which most people say is one of the worst books they've ever even tried to read. But for whatever reason, that style of writing I found really appealing. And, I was always inspired so my map making really went up in the last couple of years for that reason, because I just found it I found like a kindred spirit almost in Tolkien, in that when, it just seemed like he just lived his life working through his normal day job, but always thinking about this imagined world that had no other purpose than to just exist for his own satisfaction. And it became so alive in his mind, he had to even draw maps of his world in great detail, which to me is so crazy because so many people who do that now are inspired by him and D&D, and it has a purpose. I couldn't imagine doing that back then in the 20s, 30s. I don't know. I mean, since then I've just been, I've found it as its own interesting hobby that can also graft onto the D&D hobby to get another version of expression,
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's just something I'm not that interested in.
Well, for people who are, just to put a pin in this whole thing so we can move on with our lives, there are, for those people who have a little bit of maybe artistic ability and the interest in diving in, I think that if you have an Apple Pencil or some other digital stylus and some other computer, a tablet, but in my case, I have an Apple Pencil and an iPad. Artists themselves use things called Wacom tablets or Wacom tablets. It's a brand name that make tablets digital tablets and interfaces specifically for art making. The iPad comes pretty close to everything they can do. And there's a whole host of free programs that give you Photoshop-like functionality. So the one I am using currently is called Procreate. It's free online. I think I bought it for the full whatever membership, full ownership or whatever, for maybe $20 or something. But what those programs do to really take any art to the next level, but definitely map art, is the ability to make layers. So you start with a page that's transparent. You draw your sketch on it. This is where I want my mountains. You do it super rough, like you would see in any, 12-year-old, map. Just crappy mountains, line for a river, dots for towns, then anything else. And once you have that, you can then open up a new layer and then take maybe like an inking pen and really go over in detail. And that onion process of layering on top of layering on top of layering, it allows you to create a line art version of whatever map you're wanting to do, create your geography and your rough ideas. And then you just keep adding layers. You put, it allows you to put, titles and color and any other flourishes you want on the map. But it also gives you the security knowing that if you mess it up, you can just erase that one element. It's anything that's on that layer. So that Photoshop style of art creation really lends itself to this hobby and making it easy. The last little diatribe about that is that those programs, for the people who don't fancy themselves an artist, because my hand shakes like a leaf in the wind, most of them have like an auto correct or kind of like a smoothing option. I would say Autodesk, a Sketchbook, is a similar program that has the best feature of that. If you just turn on the functionality, it's called like line assist, I guess. It just smooths your line. So if you got a shaky hand, it anticipates. And if you mess it up, you just undo and you just go back and draw the line again. A couple times, you usually have the line you're looking for. Procreate has a similar function too. But those tools in particular, can allow someone who just wants to stick with it and make a really nice, even if it's just a simple black and white, just to make your lines look smooth, make your rivers look proportional, and put a little extra touch. Those tools are a great help. Wow, I think I just blasted through pretty much all of that stuff.
Well, I don't have anything additional unless you do.
I could talk forever on this particular subject, but I should not. I would just recommend it. Anybody who, I guess the last thought I would say is that, a lot of people out there are like not able to actually play the hobby. And I was one of those people for years where life got busy, I had some kids and just kind of thought, okay, well, that was fun that I did when I was a kid, but that's not something I can do now. I never lost that thought though of like world building. And if you're just kind of trapped in a situation where you just don't have gamers and you don't have people to play with, I would encourage you to just go ahead and keep building. Find the fun in the hobby for its own sake, because eventually you're going to have the opportunity to express that. It might turn into something else. It might turn into a book. It might turn into short stories. It might turn into a hobby in its own right. I'm getting to the point now where I need the little extra oomph to push myself towards finishing maps. So I've thought maybe I could, you could go to like Fiverr, I guess, was that the right site, where you can kind of like a freelancer, an Etsy kind of thing, where you can maybe offer your services, give to make maps for other people and turn it into a side hustle. I would encourage anybody who needs to scratch that creative itch to dive in, because the barrier to entry is really low in our technology world, and it's surprisingly easy to get pretty good pretty quick. So give it a try. All right.
Well, are you ready to move on to geek things? Do you have anything that you haven't already recommended that you're going to recommend as a geek thing?
Yikes, this whole pod's been a geek thing for me. I'll go completely off topic. Ahsoka. I recently started watching the Ahsoka show. For an old Star Wars nerd who all I ever wanted was Jedi in my life, this show's giving me everything I've ever wanted. So if you haven't started watching it, go give it a shot.
I'm going to be watching it very soon. I just got a Disney subscription for a few months, so I'm catching up on The Mandalorian, and then I'm going to watch Andor and then Ahsoka.
Oh, that sounds like a great time.
My only geek thing is a YouTube channel by the channel Map Crow, a very specific video, how to build a better dungeon. The channel Map Crow is all about just how to create dungeon maps and other types of maps for your games. and how to improve them. But specifically, the how to build a better dungeon was a very good one in my opinion, and really helped me with figuring out how I'm going to structure my dungeons in the future.
Wow, I think I need to read that.
All right, Elliot, what do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
I think I'll just go draw a map.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.